The Black Knight. Chapter 3. Jeremy and Brock. Everyone turned away from the scene, eyes either shut tight or covered with sweaty palms. "No, no," Karen screamed. "This is my—" Karen was cut off by Jeremy's petrified scream. Ryan was about to turn and ask her what she was going to say, but they all heard the man's clanging footsteps as he descended the staircase. "You won't get away with this, you sick—" Kyle began, but Brock decided to finish his sentence. "You sick fuck!" Brock screamed into the sky. The man paused on the staircase, his bare fingers drumming on the railing. He turned into the blaring sun, his face masked in shadows behind his beanie cap and scarf. He simply bowed in front of them, his hands almost touching the ground, before proceeding across the gravel and back to the platform. He stepped over the dead body, faintly whistling. All persons in the car watched the man in the scarf climb back onto the platform and duck behind a set of gates. He casually opened the door to the nearby office and stepped inside. The door slammed behind him. The door he had just closed behind him was labeled, "Private Personnel Only." "How did this guy get into the park anyway?" Jeremy asked through his friend's retching sobs. No one could answer. 5 hours had passed, and the door marked "Private" had not opened again. It was now close to 5:30, providing all occupants in the car enough time to collect themselves after Nash and his son's death. It wasn't so much like collecting their composure as it was completely shutting down. Stomachs growled, and Jeremy looked down upon the snack stand across the way with hungry eyes. Adding insult to injury, the sun was brutal. There were hardly a dozen clouds in the sky. Ryan's skin began to redden, and his tongue became as dry as his skin. Exhaustion began to set in. Kyle was praying furiously near the back, while Brock entertained himself by spitting over the edge and watching it plummet. Brock slicked back his black hair, trying to air out his sweat-stained tank top. "Good Lord, I'm starving," Brock blurted, hawking one last loogie over the side. "I would kill for a 2 Gardens Park hot dog." "3 people just died and you're thinking about stuffing your fucking face," Jeremy remarked from directly in front of him. "Excuse me, kid, but a man has to eat," Brock replied gruffly. A bead of sweat trickled gallingly down his nose. "I'm hungry too," Cody announced, holding his belly. Ryan didn't know what to say. The only way anyone was going to get food was if they were rescued soon. His own stomach growled, and then fell silent. "We've got to try and escape. Maybe we can fit under the chest guards," Jeremy called with renewed force. "You can try, but these guards are meant to keep us restrained," Ryan replied. "We'll both try. We're smaller," Cody said. "We might be able to." With that, Cody and Jeremy tried desperately to slip under their chest guards. First they slouched low in their seats, but they weren't able to get their chins past the stiff padding. Ryan recommended that the boys put their feet up on the seats in front of them. They did so and were able to free most of their bodies. Jeremy was able to free his chest, but his head was still too large to slip underneath the guard in his seat. He groaned with frustration and pain as he wrenched his head through. His sneaker kicked at Karen's seat, forcing her to lean forward into her own chest guard in order to avoid being nailed in the head. Then, with a whoop of glee, Jeremy slid free and clambered to his feet. He smoothed out his baggy sweatshirt as everyone else cheered joyously. "Jeremy, listen to me carefully," Ryan said, and Jeremy turned his full attention to the man sitting in front of him. "You have to edge your way up that track and down the staircase, just as the man did. Then, up on the platform, try to find a button that releases our chest guards on the control board. You see where the control panel is, right?" "Yes, sir," Jeremy replied, his eyes glued to the private door. "But what if he comes out?" "Don't worry. I think he fell asleep or something. We don't have time to debate whether this is the right moment. Now, hurry!" Ryan shouted. Jeremy nodded and gulped. He high-fived his friend Cody while following the aisle to the back of the car. Kyle patted the boy as he passed, and Brock slugged him softly on the arm. He was beaming. Jeremy stepped onto the track and began to climb toward the staircase on his hands and knees. He scurried up the gate and stepped onto the platform. With a deep breath, Jeremy darted down the stairs, long hair trailing behind him in yellow whips. No one saw the private door crack open. In that moment, the sun was just about to extinguish in the west, and a slight chill had swept over 2 Gardens theme park before anyone knew any better. Jeremy reached the bottom of the stairs and tore across the gravel, feet crunching and kicking up dust. The boy passed Nash's corpse without a sideways glance and climbed onto the concrete platform. He inspected the closed door for a good 30 seconds before crossing the platform to reach the control panel. An overhead roof protected the platform, and Jeremy gratefully basked in the shade. Then Ryan watched the boy bend over the panel, hand hovering over a set of switches. A hand scratched absently at his scalp. Ryan tried to call down to him, but the boy was too far to hear. Jeremy then reached for a set of switches, and all the passengers held their breaths. Suddenly, the door to the office burst open and the man in the scarf appeared, a rifle slung across his shoulder. He went eye level with the rifle's scope just as Jeremy turned to look. An echoing report resounded across the area, and Jeremy was thrown backward into the control panel. A red stain began to spread over his yellow sweatshirt, his mouth open and gurgling blood. The boy's eyes bulged outside his skull as his hands beat harshly upon the buttons and switches next to him. The man cocked the rifle with precise accuracy and set it against his shoulder again. Brock's chest guard suddenly heaved up from his body seconds after Jeremy struck the controls. Yet he only sat there for an extended moment, attention still drawn to the source of all the danger directly below him. Jeremy still slapped the buttons across his hips with open hands, which incited the gunman to squeeze the trigger again. Jeremy's head was driven backwards into the buttons, a red gaping hole replacing his left eye. There was a familiar hum as the Black Knight came back to life. Once again, a burst of cold, fierce wind struck Ryan and Karen in the face as the Black Knight descended the track toward the first upside-down loop. Ryan white-knuckled the handholds on either side of him, eyes blown dry in the wind. He tried to crane his neck to see what the gunman was doing, but it was no use. No one saw Jeremy die. The Black Knight car approached the crest of the loop with throttling speed. Brock saw this and tried to pull his guard back down across his chest, but it remained out of reach. He then tried to rebuckle his seatbelt, but was only able to find one end of the buckle. He realized that he had to be sitting on the other end. Brock gripped the side of the seat, muscles bulging and cords standing out in his neck. He screamed hoarsely as the car mounted the loop's upward arc, his own fate already decided. They rounded the loop and found themselves upside down, the G-force tugging at Brock's head, legs, chest, and arms. Gravity finally took hold of him and tore Brock from his seat with little resistance. With one last sharp cry, Brock slipped away from his car and seemed to disappear into the sky. Ryan didn't see him fall, but the car came to another jolting stop on the track, and this time they were stuck at an upward-sloping angle. Ryan could see the platform well from that angle, where the gunman was still fiddling with the blood-stained controls. The lifeless form of Jeremy lay at his feet. Once he was able to gather his wits and blink the tears from his eyes, he realized that Brock was gone. Ryan cocked his head to the left to see that Brock was lying face first in the gravel, some 100 feet from Nash's body. The gunman stood over the boy's body for a second or two before striding back to the office, rifle in hand. All men and women in the car watched the killer disappear into the office, leaving them alone once again. "No! No!" Cody cried, thrashing bitterly in his seat. His toes kicked the back of Ryan's seat. "No!" Ryan had begun to fall apart as well. His hands were limp at his side, his face fallen and shattered. Tears welled up in his eyes, and his lower lip trembled. "Just a kid," Ryan muttered. He stared uselessly down at his shaking hands. Then Karen said something to Ryan that he would never forget. "Ryan, when I go, promise me you won't watch me die," she sobbed. "Promise me you won't look at my broken body on the ground down there." "Karen?" Ryan asked. He stared deep into her eyes, but they seemed to retract away from him. "Promise me," she snapped. Her eyes searched his thoroughly. I promise," he replied. Ryan quickly averted eye contact with his girlfriend, mind racing. He then reassessed the graveyard below him and began to sob for the first time. Tears, long overdue, streaked down his cheeks. He cried for Mr. Stevens still hanging from the cursed statue marking their collective graveyard. He cried for the man who wasn't afraid as he fell, for the boy whose scalp hung from a hook like a terrible fishing lure, for the boy who had been shot on sight, and for the man who had literally held on for his life. Most of all, Ryan cried for his empty shell of a girlfriend, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she knew more than him. He cried to the heavens, cursing God for his mistake. He had let children die, and had little care for the women and children either. He fell asleep in this way, some time after the sun blinked away into night, dividing them from safety and from hope.